The hill that would later bear walls and courts was once only a rise of pale limestone, exposed to the wind and the long patience of sun and shadow. Before the chisels arrived, before cedar beams crossed the air, the ground carried the marks of feet and fire rather than architecture. Paths were worn not by procession but by repetition, by the daily climb of herders and elders, by those who came carrying grain, oil, or nothing at all. The valleys around the hill folded inward like quiet witnesses, holding morning mist and the smell of damp earth, while the hill itself remained bare, receiving light early and releasing it slowly. Jerusalem at this time was less a city than a habit of gathering, a place where memory settled lightly because there was little yet to preserve it in stone. The climate shaped everything, summers that bleached color from cloth and skin, winters that pressed people closer to hearths and each other. Worship existed without enclosure, shaped by the sky overhead and the ground beneath, by voices that rose and dissolved without echo. Altars were temporary, rebuilt as needed, their stones warm from the sun and darkened by smoke. Nothing here suggested permanence, only intention repeated often enough to feel stable. Politically, the kingdom moved carefully, aware of larger powers beyond the ridges and trade routes. Messages arrived quietly, carried by men who knew how to pass unnoticed, who spoke in low rooms with shutters closed against dust and listening ears. Decisions were made without ceremony, weighed against harvests, alliances, and the simple need to endure another season. The hill watched all of this without judgment, holding the impressions of camps, councils, and prayers like shallow imprints that rain could soften but not erase. In the early hours, when light first touched the stone, the place felt suspended between what it was and what it might become. There was no prophecy in the air, only awareness. Elders remembered other hills taken by other kings, and the memory restrained them. The young kingdom knew its borders were fragile, its authority negotiated daily through gifts, marriages, and restraint. Worship, therefore, carried a tone of caution as much as devotion. Songs were measured, not triumphant, and silence held as much meaning as sound. The hilltop became a place where pauses mattered, where the absence of structure allowed thought to wander without instruction. Dust settled on sandals and robes, marking those who came and went, a visible record of presence. At night, fires flickered low and the stars seemed closer without roofs to interrupt them. The sense of anticipation did not feel like expectation but like readiness, an awareness that attention itself was a form of preparation. No one yet spoke of a temple in the language of inevitability. The idea remained distant, unshaped, discussed in fragments, and deferred to more stable days. What existed instead was a shared understanding that this place mattered not because of what stood upon it, but because of what had not yet been fixed. Memory remained fluid here, carried by voices rather than walls, by gestures repeated until they felt ancient. The hill absorbed these moments quietly, storing them without emphasis. When later generations would look back, they would imagine destiny already present. But in truth there was only careful living, conducted under open sky. The stones lay scattered, uncut, indifferent to future arrangement. Wind moved through grass and cloth alike, erasing footprints by afternoon. The kingdom held itself together through habit and restraint, through the mutual recognition of limits. On this hill, before the stones, history did not announce itself. It waited, unnoticed, in the ordinary texture of days, in the way light shifted across bare rock, in the measured steps of those who climbed not to build, but simply to stand, to speak softly, and to remember where they were. The house built for order, its construction did not announce itself with sudden grandeur, but unfolded as a patient act of arrangement, measured and deliberate. Stone arrived without ceremony, hauled along familiar paths, its weight absorbed into the routines of laborers who spoke little and listened more to instruction than to praise. Cedar beams were counted, sorted, and stored in shaded yards. Their resinous scent marking time more reliably than proclamations. The temple rose not as a monument to astonish, but as a system meant to hold behavior in place. Its plan was a sequence of thresholds, each narrowing sound, light, and permission. Movement through the space was taught before it was allowed, learned in rehearsal and repetition. Walls did not merely enclose, they instructed, guiding steps and glances, separating what could be heard from what must remain unseen. Artisans worked by lamplight in enclosed rooms, their tools arranged with care. Each chisel and measure returned to its place at day's end. Nothing was left accidental, because the building itself was an argument for order. Sound was considered as carefully as stone, footsteps softened by floors, voices absorbed by hangings, bells permitted only where they signaled transition. Daily function mattered more than display. The temple opened and closed according to rhythms that matched the city's breath. At dawn, gates were unbarred in silence, the first light slipping along polished surfaces designed to reflect restraint, not excess. Incense was prepared in measured portions, its smoke rising straight in still air, a visible sign of controlled intention. Labor was divided with precision, roles assigned and remembered. Some carried, some cut, some recorded quantities on tablets kept in wooden drawers that slid closed with a sound meant to reassure. Overseers moved between rooms, their sandals leaving faint traces of dust, reminders that even order required presence. Theology was not spoken loudly, it was embedded. The arrangement of space taught who might approach, who must wait, and who could never enter. Curtains held boundaries more firmly than guards, and knowledge of sequence mattered as much as lineage. Within these walls, belief became practice, repeated until it felt natural, even inevitable. Outside, the city continued its uneven life, but inside, time slowed. The temple absorbed urgency, turning it into sequence. Silent couriers arrived with instructions folded small, delivered to side rooms where decisions were weighed without witness. These rooms were narrow, lit by lamps that smoked slightly, their soot darkening ceilings over years. Nothing here sought to impress an empire, it sought to endure one. By fixing movement and sound, by assigning places and times, the temple reduced uncertainty. It offered a model of stability in a region accustomed to change. Even the absence of decoration in certain chambers was intentional, allowing focus to settle where it was required. Ritual unfolded without audience. The most significant acts occurred beyond sight, heard only as muted movement, a brush of fabric, a breath released. Those who served learned to read the building, to understand its cues and restraints. Architecture became instruction, correcting posture, tempering voice, shaping thought. In this way, the temple functioned daily as a machine of order, its workings quiet, its effects cumulative. No single moment defined it, meaning accrued through repetition. The priests moved through spaces they did not own, carrying responsibilities heavier than the vessels they lifted. Records were kept with equal care, stored away from light, consulted when alignment faltered. In drawers and niches, tallies and instructions rested, awaiting hands trained to open them. The temple did not explain itself. It required participation. Visitors sensed this immediately, adjusting their pace as sound diminished. Authority here was felt rather than declared, present in the way doors narrowed, in the pause before entry. By encoding hierarchy into stone, the temple translated belief into daily habit. It was never separate from governance. The same logic that ordered ritual informed rule, reinforcing obedience without force. Decisions made in small rooms echoed outward, steadied by the assurance that the structure would hold. Thus, the house stood not as spectacle, but as framework. It organized bodies, time, and expectation, reducing the vastness of belief to manageable steps. In its ordered calm, the kingdom found a way to speak softly and persist, sustained by a building that asked nothing of the eye, and everything of attention. It was within this discipline that continuity took root, not through awe but through familiarity. Day after day, the same paths were walked, the same gestures repeated, until order felt less imposed than inherited. Even absence was shaped here, with empty spaces preserved to remind those within of limits they did not set. Beyond the walls, empires shifted, treaties frayed, and borders moved. But the temple's order remained consistent, offering a stable rhythm amid uncertainty. It did not promise safety. It provided procedure. In that restraint, there was comfort, a sense that meaning could be maintained even as circumstances changed. Those who remembered its early days spoke not of brilliance, but of clarity. They recalled how the building taught patience, how it asked them to move slowly, to consider each step. In doing so, it shaped a people accustomed to listening, prepared to endure long after stone itself would be remembered only through fragments and records kept in quiet places. Here, order was not rigid, but sustaining, a discipline that allowed life to continue without excess. The house fulfilled its purpose each day. It remained functional, uncelebrated, and intact. In its quiet efficiency, the unseen machinery of belief turned, steady and unremarked, holding together a world that depended on balance more than display, and memory more than acclaim. It remained, above all, a place where order was practiced, not proclaimed, and where the slow work of alignment continued without witness, sustained by hands that expected no recognition, and by rooms that remembered every footstep, long after voices had faded, preserving a calm within stone and silence, sufficient for those who knew how to remain attentive inside its walls. The men who watched the silence, the men who served within the ordered spaces, learned first how to be still. Before they learned the sequence of offerings or the weight of vessels, they learned when not to move, when not to speak, and how to listen to rooms that carried meaning in their quiet. Training unfolded slowly, guided by older hands that corrected without display. A misplaced step was noted, not punished, and the lesson was repetition. Hierarchy revealed itself through proximity rather than proclamation, through who waited closest to the inner doors and who remained where light thinned. These distinctions were absorbed over years, becoming instinctive. Each man understood his place, not through instruction alone but through the daily experience of boundaries. Their routines began before dawn, washing hands in cold water, adjusting garments that bore no ornament beyond function. The temple at that hour belonged to them alone, its corridors holding the smell of oil and old stone. Sound traveled differently then. Every movement registered, encouraging restraint. Custodianship extended beyond ritual into memory. Writing was part of this discipline, taught as careful observation rather than declaration. Records were kept to align practice, not to inspire belief. Ink was mixed in small bowls, tablets prepared with attention to surface and edge. Notes described quantities, timing, anomalies so minor they seemed unworthy of attention, yet they were preserved all the same. These writings were stored away from ceremony, placed in drawers whose contents were known only to those tasked with maintaining them. There was no expectation of audience. The act of recording was service, a way of preventing drift. Within the priestly ranks, knowledge accumulated unevenly. Some men learned only the actions assigned to them, while others were trained to see patterns across years. Those few moved quietly between spaces, consulting records by lamplight in narrow rooms where ceilings pressed close. Decisions were made. They're about correction and continuity, adjustments small enough to pass unnoticed, yet significant enough to preserve order. Silent couriers sometimes delivered questions from outside authorities, requests phrased carefully to avoid intrusion. Responses were composed with equal care, grounded in precedent rather than opinion. The priest's authority rested in this restraint. They were visible during ritual, yet invisible in governance, shaping outcomes through adherence rather than command. Their internal hierarchies were reinforced through access to knowledge. Senior men instructed juniors through demonstration, allowing mistakes to surface and be corrected without comment. The discipline fostered patience. Over time, the repetition dulled personal ambition, replacing it with an awareness of continuity. Writing reflected this ethos. Language remained spare, factual, resistant to flourish. Even moments of disruption were recorded without emphasis, as deviations to be noted and addressed. These documents accumulated quietly, layer upon layer, forming a memory that belonged to no single individual. The men understood that their work would likely remain unseen. That understanding shaped their tone, removing urgency. They wrote as if for the building itself, as if the walls required reassurance. In the evenings, after gates closed, some remained to review entries, smoothing tablets, returning them to their places. Candlelight flickered against shelves, shadows shifting without drama. Outside the city murmured, unaware of these labors. The priests' lives were circumscribed, their days measured by ritual intervals and the slow turning of seasons. Yet within that constraint, they cultivated attentiveness. Silence became a tool, a way to hear discrepancies before they grew. Watching the silence meant recognizing when something was absent or altered. A missing sound, a delayed arrival, a misaligned object all signaled potential disorder. These observations found their way into records, not as warnings but as data. Over years, such details formed a quiet narrative of maintenance. The men aged within this system, their movements slowing, their authority increasing through familiarity rather than decree. Younger priests learned to read their pauses as instruction. When they spoke, it was often to recall something written long before, retrieving memory from drawers rarely opened. The practice of writing bound generations, allowing continuity without reliance on personal recollection. In this way, the priests served as custodians, not of revelation but of process. Their faith expressed itself through preservation. They trusted that order, once established and tended, would outlast them. There was humility in this approach, an acceptance of anonymity. The men watched the silence because it revealed truth without spectacle. Through their restraint, the temple functioned as intended, its rituals consistent, its records intact. The unseen machinery of history turned quietly in their hands. Maintained through careful observation, disciplined writing, and a commitment to continuity that asked for no recognition beyond the stability it sustained. In moments of uncertainty, they turned not to inspiration but to accumulated notes, tracing prior responses to similar conditions. This reliance on precedent created a sense of depth, a feeling that time itself participated in their decisions. Even personal grief or doubt was set aside upon entering the space, absorbed by routine. The temple demanded consistency, and the priests offered it through self-effacement. Their names mattered less than their accuracy. When illness or age removed a man from service, another stepped into his place with minimal ceremony, guided by records that preserved method over memory. Thus, the institution remained stable despite individual loss. The men accepted this as natural, even comforting. Their world valued continuity above expression. By watching the silence, by writing what others overlooked, they ensured that the temple's order persisted without interruption. The absence of drama was itself a measure of success. In the end, their legacy was not a story told aloud, but a pattern maintained, a quiet assurance that daily life could proceed within established bounds. The records slept in their drawers, the rituals repeated, and the men moved through their roles with deliberate calm, sustaining a structure that relied on their willingness to remain unseen, attentive, and precise. In that measured obscurity, history endured, carried forward by disciplined hands, attentive eyes, and a silence trusted to remember what voices never preserved. Records that did not travel the records themselves moved little, though the world beyond them shifted constantly. Tablets and scrolls rested in wooden drawers, their surfaces darkened by smoke and the passing of countless fingers, each mark deliberate and repeated over decades. The men who wrote them had intended only to preserve routine, noting quantities, rituals, and schedules with careful detachment, unaware that the currents of empire would render some of their efforts invisible. As political power changed hands, the city's administrators arrived with priorities measured in tribute, taxation, and borders rather than memory. Documents that had once guided daily ritual were sorted, misfiled, or ignored, moved to corners of storerooms where light rarely reached. Dust gathered not as decay but as a silent witness, layering upon layers of neglect, preserving form while diminishing immediate legibility. Some scrolls were removed, catalogued according to criteria the priests could not comprehend, folded and stored with the same care but a different intent. Others simply disappeared, taken by couriers whose purpose was efficiency rather than preservation, carried from building to building, sometimes arriving, sometimes lost to the unnoticed corridors of empire. In the small rooms where decisions were quietly made, officials consulted the records only when necessity compelled, skimming contents for what confirmed authority or justified action. What could not serve an administrative function was set aside, left to linger in obscurity. This selective attention created an invisible hierarchy of memory, one in which certain events, names, and quantities endured while countless others remained suspended in silence. Over time, the record's context shifted. The priests' careful notations became marginalia to administrators, functional only in the narrowest sense. Their original purpose, the safeguarding of ritual, the encoding of behavior, the quiet orchestration of order, was invisible to those who now possessed them. Light in these rooms was dim, often provided by oil lamps that flickered with a low hum, smoke curling upward to blackened ceiling beams. Hands handled fragile documents with a practical restraint, fingers tracing familiar edges, flipping parchment slowly as if the material itself might resist examination. Small errors introduced by haste or oversight compounded with neglect, creating a web of partial memory. Yet even in absence, the records exerted influence. Their mere presence dictated procedures, constrained speech, and imposed order by default. Officials who understood little of their content still responded to their arrangement, aware that disruption could have unforeseen consequences. Empires archived not truth but utility. What was deemed useful tax records, census data, legal decrees was preserved, while the subtler details of priestly observation were left to dark drawers or forgotten shelves. Over decades, this filtering reshaped history itself. Knowledge became what survived selection rather than what had been observed. Couriers moved silently along corridors, carrying memoranda from one administrator to another, passing by rooms where stacks of priestly tablets waited, unread and unremarked. In some cases, records were misplaced, their containers misnumbered, or stored in unfamiliar chambers, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later. When rediscovery occurred, it was often accidental, a servant shifting bundles, a scholar consulting an archive for unrelated work, a curious hand tracing spines in low light. The silent accumulation of years gave these objects a weight beyond their physicality. They bore witness to absence as much as presence, to priorities lost or denied, and to the quiet labor that had created them. The temple's internal order contrasted with external disorder. Where the priests had maintained rhythm, sequence, and hierarchy, the administrative empires imposed efficiency, improvisation, and disregard. The contrast was stark. Inside, each mark on a tablet mattered, each tally reflected care. Outside, documents were instruments of convenience, their original meaning secondary to practicality. Fires burned low in chambers at night, casting shadows that played across labels, seals, and edges. The smell of oil and smoke, combined with the faint aroma of parchment, created an atmosphere of deferred attention. Here, decisions were sometimes made without consultation, relying on memory or precedent rather than observation, illustrating the distance between original intent and bureaucratic execution. In some corners, records that had been set aside began to deteriorate, ink fading, clay cracking, leather stiffening. Neglect became inadvertent preservation, halting human interference but leaving traces of both care and oversight. Every crease, smudge, or missing corner carried meaning, revealing how history was shaped as much by absence as by action. The selective survival of documents mirrored the selective memory of rulers. Empires preserved what was useful to them and allowed the remainder to fade into obscurity, a silent commentary on power and the impermanence of human priorities. Scholars later would reconstruct fragments of past rituals, noting the gaps, hypothesizing motivations, and tracing patterns where continuity remained. Yet the full texture of the priest's work, their quiet discipline, and the deliberate observation encoded in daily records were often inaccessible, surviving only as partial impressions. In rooms where drawers had not been opened for decades, dust and shadows conspired to protect secrets. Occasional glimpses of tablets or scrolls, illuminated by flickering lamps, revealed precise strokes and careful notes, evidence of a meticulous order long unappreciated. These records spoke in whispers, demanding patience, attention, and humility from those who consulted them. The machinery of preservation was subtle, dependent on repetition and cautious handling rather than ceremony. Small corrections, marginal marks, and annotations survived by chance as much as by design. In corridors and chambers, the interplay of light and shadow rendered the documents semi-visible, creating an atmosphere in which observation required calm, deliberate motion. Touching a record became an act of reverence, the tactile connection bridging centuries of quiet diligence. While empires shifted above, the priestly records endured in silence, their persistence fragile yet enduring. Their survival was neither total nor guaranteed, yet each preserved fragment offered a portal into a world otherwise inaccessible. Histories were written in part through their absence, in part through the continuity that survived neglect. These objects held authority without audience, shaping decisions indirectly, informing practices without recognition. The records that did not travel were a testament to this quiet power, a reminder that preservation is not always intentional, and that influence may extend beyond visibility. The gentle accumulation of centuries left imprints of human attention, decision, and oversight, tracing the machinery of administration, ritual, and habit. In their shadows, one glimpsed the careful interplay between memory and loss, the deliberate act of writing, and the persistent silence of what remained unsaid. Within drawers and rooms where lamps flickered, these records waited, indifferent to circumstance, guarding a past that only the patient could reconstruct, offering insight not through spectacle but through the slow, steady persistence of observation, the deliberate act of documentation, and the quiet, unacknowledged work that forms the undercurrent of history itself. When the temple became a reference, the temple, once a space of measured steps and quiet attention, existed now largely in memory and record, its stone and timber receding from lived experience into abstraction. Walls that had absorbed the whispers of priests, that had guided movement through rituals rehearsed for decades, were replaced in consciousness by texts, drawings, and second-hand accounts, fragments preserved by those who never entered its inner courts. The air, once heavy with incense and the warmth of oil lamps, now carried only the suggestion of those scents in dusty archives and faded scrolls. Later generations consulted these traces with care, some seeking theological guidance, others authority for political ends, rarely able to perceive the spatial discipline that had structured daily life. Each reference, each notation, transformed the temple from living architecture into symbolic apparatus, Words on parchment or etched into marginalia bore the weight of distance, their tone formal, often abstract. The concrete sensations of space and movement filtered through layers of interpretation. Descriptions of gates, columns, and courtyards lost precision over decades. The dimensions remembered only approximately, their orientation dependent on the priorities of scribes and compilers. The subtle distinctions that governed access, the rhythm of steps, the modulation of voice, the pause before entry became generalized into phrases of propriety, ritual, or authority, losing the tactile resonance of lived experience. Scholars and clerics, working in dimly lit chambers, traced these references with careful fingers, opening drawers long closed, handling parchment that smelled faintly of resin and decay. Lamps flickered against margins crowded with notes, some ancient, some added generations later. Each annotation layered interpretation atop observation, creating a palimpsest of understanding in which original practice was partially visible but never fully present. Empires and authorities that wielded these texts did so selectively. References were cited to legitimize rule, to support legal or theological claims, to frame narratives in which the temple symbolized continuity and obedience. In doing so, they abstracted the temple further, emphasizing structure over experience, hierarchy over subtlety. Small details survived: the width of a gate, the presence of a chamber, the sequence of offerings, but these were often noted in service of administrative or ideological convenience, divorced from the rhythm and discipline of daily enact. Readers of these documents, separated from the original sensory reality, projected their own assumptions, coloring stone and timber with the priorities of their own time. The temple became a reference point, a marker in a landscape of memory and authority rather than a space of movement and breath. Pilgrims, historians, and officials alike encountered it first as text, then as illustration, with experience mediated by interpretation rather than direct observation. Within archives, the smell of aged ink mingled with the faint dust of neglected drawers. Silent couriers occasionally delivered notes, requests, and marginal corrections, further displacing the original, tactile knowledge. Rooms where these documents were stored were narrow, ceilings low, lamps set to flicker without glare. Decisions about use or preservation occurred quietly, often by officials who knew the symbolic value more than the procedural reality. These choices compounded abstraction. Some texts were prioritized, copied, and referenced. Others remained in storage, unseen and unconsulted, their details preserved without context. The temple's original order, its calibration of steps, sound, and access diminished with each transcription, each citation, each reference. Where priests had maintained rhythm through presence, now rhythm was inferred from words, approximated through study, and codified for bureaucratic or theological ends. Even the names of chambers, previously associated with specific duties and timing, became signifiers of concept rather than location. The broader historical shifts in religion, governance, and empire were traced through these references. As powers changed, the temple was invoked, reshaped in narrative, used to affirm authority or continuity. Texts were annotated to reflect new doctrine, new legal structures, and new imperial priorities. The weight of empire pressed upon memory, filtering what mattered and what could be ignored. What survived was often symbolic rather than practical, the temple as emblem rather than as functional space. Yet small details endured in ways unexpected. A measurement noted in a margin, a description of a daily routine, a reference to a ceremonial vessel. These fragments connected later generations to a material past they could no longer inhabit, offering glimpses of ritual precision, the discipline of observation, and the spatial choreography that had defined practice. In chambers where scholars worked, they felt the material history through touch, the smooth edge of a tablet, the grain of parchment, the warmth of lamp flame against their hands. These sensations, though faint, echoed the care and attention once demanded of priests, bridging centuries through tactility and patience. Interpretation, however, remained necessary. The original context was partially lost. Spatial sequences, sounds, and scents had dissipated. Each generation reconstructed, sometimes accurately, sometimes abstractly, assembling continuity from fragments. The temple's presence in historical consciousness became more legal, theological, and symbolic than architectural or functional. When references were cited, they carried authority derived from perceived antiquity rather than from direct observation. Documents that described doors, halls, and rituals were treated as precedent, guiding behavior in absence of physical structures. Over time, the temple functioned less as a space one could enter and more as a conceptual framework, invoked to stabilize social, religious, and political order. This abstraction allowed distant authorities to anchor decisions in the imagined authority of the past. Even as the lived sensory experience of the temple had faded beyond reach, scholars working by candlelight traced annotations, noting discrepancies, and occasionally correcting minor errors, yet fully comprehending the original organization remained impossible. These chambers, with their dim light and layered shadows, held traces of countless hands, attentive to detail but separated by decades or centuries from their sources. In such environments, the temple existed as much in silence as in text. Marginal notes whispered observations, corrections, and reminders. Each fragment of description carried the weight of absence, a faint echo of the discipline once exercised daily within stone walls and under low ceilings. The temple became both reference and archive, its authority mediated by those who consulted records, applied interpretations, and transmitted fragments of knowledge across generations. Its ritual, once immediate and sensory, persisted now as notation, symbol, and guideline. The original dimensions, smells, and rhythms could only be imagined, reconstructed through careful study, inference, and sensitivity to nuance preserved in words and annotations. Even as its physicality faded, the temple retained influence. Authors, officials, and observers drew upon it to structure thought, to guide action, and to orient moral and social order. Its presence shaped cultural memory, guiding expectations and practices, even when its lived reality was inaccessible. References, whether accurate or abstracted, served as tools of continuity. In reading them, one discerned not the temple itself but the labor, discipline, and care that had once maintained it. The temple, though no longer occupied, remained present through the meticulous record-keeping of those who remembered, the annotations of those who studied, and the quiet decisions of those who invoked it to legitimate authority. In this way, the temple's influence endured, mediated through text, observation, and reflection, sustaining memory across generations even as direct experience vanished. Stones that no longer argued the temple no longer stood as it had, yet the weight of its presence lingered in fragments, in shadows cast by empty foundations, in the faint impressions left in clay, ink, and memory. Stones that once guided footsteps, that carried the subtle pressure of ritualized movement, now rested in silence, their arguments dissolved into dust and shadow. Where halls had contained the measured rhythm of ceremony, there was only open air and the faint scent of earth turned by wind and rain. The buildings of empire had risen and fallen around them, indifferent to the careful labor that had once organized sound, light, and gesture. Yet the memory of order persisted in the records that remained, imperfect and fragmentary, as though the temple itself had been absorbed into the archival habits of those who observed, copied, and stored. Drawers closed for centuries in rooms now emptied of function held tablets and scrolls that recorded procedures, tallies, and sequences, their ink fading, edges fraying, but their presence signaling the discipline that had once animated the space. Lamps left to flicker dimly, or their memory preserved in notation, cast shadows across these relics, reminding any who approached that attention itself was a form of preservation. The silence that enveloped the stones was active, a measure of what remained in absence. Where authority had been exercised through movement, gesture, and ritual, it now persisted only in text and in inference, in the careful study of line and mark, of placement and timing. The stones themselves argued no longer. They could not insist, correct, or respond. Their mute testimony depended on those willing to observe subtle traces, to read between shadows and markings, to reconstruct sequences from fragmentary guidance. Generations of readers, scholars, and clerics approached these remnants with varying degrees of understanding, guided by an awareness that what survived was partial and provisional. Marginalia offered glimpses into prior observation, faint corrections hinting at the discipline required to maintain continuity. Yet much remained obscured, the broader architecture of behavior lost to time. Within dim chambers, hands moved carefully over parchment and clay, tracing edges, noting impressions, handling fragments with deliberate restraint, aware that the work of understanding was as much preservation as interpretation. Lamps flickered against walls, dust motes drifting in slow spirals, each movement a reminder of centuries passing without attention. The temple, though absent, continued to shape perception. Its order had once structured human action. Its records now structured thought. Authority, memory, and habit persisted in subtle ways, mediated through the deliberate reading of incomplete documentation. Silence became a lens through which the past could be apprehended. The absence of living ritual, teaching, caution, attentiveness, and patience. In this quiet, one discerned the mechanisms that had enabled continuity, recognizing that preservation depended not solely on monuments but on the careful repetition of detail, the attentive recording of sequences, and the discretion to note what mattered without embellishment. Fragments of description measurements, sequences, procedural notes offered the skeleton of a world that no longer functioned, a structure of behavior preserved in absence. They revealed a civilization attentive to order, attentive to restraint, and attentive to the subtlety of instruction. Even as walls crumbled or were repurposed, even as cedar beams decayed into soil, these remnants carried authority, quiet and indirect, shaping memory without spectacle. Observers centuries later reconstructed spaces, rituals, and sequences through the intersection of fragmentary data and careful inference. Each fragment required contextualization, patience, and respect for what had been lost. The process of engagement demanded deliberate slowing of pace, attention to shadows, smells, textures, and the faint echoes of prior hands, eyes, and breath. One sensed, in tracing these remnants, the persistence of invisible labor, the continuous observation and recording that had maintained order in a space now uninhabited. Authority had been encoded in the environment, in thresholds, in the modulation of sound and gesture. Its remnants now encoded in records, in marks, and in shadows of past activity. No single fragment could convey the entirety of meaning. Rather, significance emerged from accumulation, from careful juxtaposition, from the recognition of pattern across absence. The temple became a lens not of triumph but of endurance. Its physical absence offered insight into the manner in which history survives unevenly, selectively, and often imperfectly. Fragments spoke louder in their persistence than in any completeness, demonstrating that memory depends on attentiveness, restraint, and the fidelity of small acts of preservation. In the corridors of modern study, the smell of aged ink, the texture of fraying parchment, and the faint warmth of oil lamp flame simulated the original cadence of observation. Scholars and clerics, silent in low-lit rooms, traced lines, counted columns, and cross-referenced sequences, aware that the temple's living order was irretrievable yet still legible in its structural logic. Through this careful engagement, patterns of behavior, hierarchy, and ritual order were discernible, not as living phenomena but as enduring principles encoded in records, requiring interpretation to animate understanding. In this contemplation, absence itself became meaningful. The stones no longer argued, yet their silence carried instruction. The fragments of record, imperfect and scattered, conveyed authority through meticulous preservation and attentive study. Every marginal note, every folded tablet, every faintly scrawled instruction served as a testament to restraint and continuity, revealing the mechanisms by which a structured past persisted despite dissolution. The temple's legacy, then, was not spectacle, nor triumph, nor moral proclamation. It was a quiet demonstration of how careful attention and methodical preservation allow history to endure in fragmentary form. In handling these remnants, one sensed the continuity of human endeavor, the unseen labor that underwrote ritual, governance, and memory. Each touch connected observer to long-past hands. Each shadowed chamber offered perspective on the fragility and persistence of knowledge, and each fragment hinted at the depth of discipline required to maintain order in a world that did not guarantee permanence. Even as empires rose and fell around the site, the principles encoded in the temple's records remained, waiting to be read, interpreted, and understood with patience. Silence, presence, and restraint became as informative as the documents themselves. The temple endured not as a living structure but as an archival principle, a system preserved in fragments, shaping understanding without spectacle, teaching continuity without imposition, and offering insight through absence rather than assertion. In the end, those stones that no longer argued continued to communicate through their residual order, their influence surviving in the careful reading of what remained, the patient reconstruction of pattern, and the slow, deliberate tracing of attention across centuries. History, in this quiet meditation, survives because attention endures, because fragments bear weight, and because silence, handled with care, conveys what voice alone cannot.